Hey gang, welcome back. Today we're going to explore one of horror's most disturbing yet underrated monsters, Rawhead Rex. The ancient creature wasn't just another movie monster, it was almost 9 feet tall. According to Clive Barker's short story, Rawhead Rex, from Books of Blood, Volume 3 in 1984, he was an ancient pre-Christian being who was driven almost entirely by violence and endless hunger for human flesh. The story was later adapted into the 1986 film Rawhead Rex. But Clive Barker wasn't very happy with how the monster was portrayed on screen. So, today we're going to explore everything that made Rawhead Rex so terrifying. We'll look at this monstrous anatomy, insane strength, durability, feeding habits, supernatural abilities, and one of the ancient forces that could actually make this unstoppable creature afraid. Then we'll finish off by looking at the fascinating differences between Barker's original story and the controversial film adaptation. So, without further ado, let's begin. What does Rawhead Rex actually look like? Unlike traditional horror monsters such as vampires or werewolves, Rawhead Rex is distinguished from the get-go by his almost unreal appearance. Indeed, it seems that Barker has deliberately tried to make the monster as unpleasant and monstrous looking as possible. The particular wording of the initial description in the short story Rawhead Rex in Books of Blood Volume 3 actually gives the readers a chance to imagine how the monster would look in the adapter's vision. Thus, in the original text, Rawhead Rex is described as a 9-foot-tall giant, which is much higher than an average person. In addition, he has a massive muscled body, which makes him look intimidating even when not paying attention to his appearance. However, his face is the most remarkable feature, as he looks like a head of raw meat, which explains the monster's name. Barker wrote, "His amber eyes burnt in its pallid, pitted face," which already gives the character a terrible look. However, Rawhead Rex also has a gaping mouth, from which rows of sharp teeth protrude, ready to swallow any victim. Overall, Barker seems to have deliberately overdone the monster's appearance, making it look like an extremely violent and unpleasant mass of raw meat and bones. However, when Rawhead Rex was depicted on screen in the 1986 movie, his appearance was changed to some extent, probably because the creators couldn't afford such an expensive special effect, so they had to work with what they had. Instead of 9 feet of raw meat and bones, the movie's monster appeared as a giant wearing a leather suit. The head of the monster was quite impressive, but only because it was a huge inflatable head. It was covered with matted black hair and 2 little red lights for eyes. The original appearance of the monster was deliberately exaggerated and unpleasant, intending to show the audience its most terrifying side. As for the movie's monster, it seems that many of his symbols have been abandoned, making him much less frightening. For example, in the movie, the monster doesn't have sexual characteristics, while in the story, his appearance is very phallic. Is Rawhead Rex actually based on real folklore? So it seems that the name Rawhead Rex was not actually thought up by Clive Barker, but was instead borrowed from an old piece of English folklore aptly named Rawhead and Bloody Bones, also referred to as Tommy Rawhead. So in short, Rawhead Rex is based on real folklore. Now, Rawhead and Bloody Bones was a type of boogeyman, utilized by parents to scare their children into behaving, and as a result, most children would behave for fear of the monster. The monster would punish any child who strayed from their parents' teachings. The stories may differ from region to region, but the underlying context was always the same, that the monster was used to scare children. But Rawhead and Bloody Bones wasn't merely a figure of speech passed down from parent to child. It had been recorded long before its conception. The first written record of the creature was made in 1548, so the legend predates the first recording by about 4.5 centuries. But the tailing concept of Rawhead and Bloody Bones wasn't limited to just parents and teachers using it to scare children into behaving. The monster appeared in literature as well, most notably perhaps in the writing of John Locke in 1693, where it appeared as a means to frighten children. But Rawhead and Bloody Bones also made an appearance in the writing of Samuel Johnson in 1755. This proves that Rawhead and Bloody Bones had been part of England's cultural history for a very long time. However, it seems that while Clive Barker may have borrowed the name, he did put his own twist on the ancient monster. Aside from the name and the concept of an ancient monster that stalked the woods and predated Christianity, Rawhead Rex is largely the creation of Clive Barker himself. As opposed to merely using Rawhead as a boogeyman, Barker reinterprets the monster as an ancient pre-Christian entity with its own unique set of traits and characteristics. So in short, while Clive Barker borrowed the name and the concept behind Rawhead Rex from English folklore, most other things about the monster were his own creation. With that out of the way, let's examine the abilities of this ancient monster. How strong and durable is Rawhead Rex's body? Rawhead Rex's body is presented as a horrifying work of art, but was it as monstrous and durable as it looked? Although his size made him appear almost unstoppable, his actual feats showed that Rawhead Rex was powerful, but not invincible. For example, one of the most impressive displays of Rawhead Rex's power was his ability to tear open car doors with ease in the film. On the contrary, Rawhead Rex was surprisingly vulnerable to conventional attacks. For example, in the movie, Rex was wounded when he was shot, but it didn't stop him from pursuing his goals. Thus, his body was durable enough to withstand serious blows, but not indestructible. As mentioned above, even though Rawhead Rex's body wasn't monstrous, he still had supernatural durability. Although his regeneration was never confirmed, his ability to survive injuries that would kill an ordinary human proved his supernatural durability, which allowed him to continue hunting even after being wounded. Thus, his supernatural durability made him a truly terrifying monster. It should be noted that this characteristic was the result of his supernatural strength, which was much greater than that of an average human. However, even though Rawhead Rex's body was indeed monstrous, it wasn't the most horrifying part about it. The fact that made Rex terrifying was his insatiable hunger, which presented a much greater existential threat than his physical appearance. What does Rawhead Rex actually eat, and why children specifically? Although Rawhead Rex's body made him a fearsome monster, his constant hunger is what truly made him terrifying. Unlike many horror villains, he wasn't driven by a goal or ambition, but by his need to consume humans. In both the source material for Rawhead Rex, the short story Rawhead Rex in Books of Blood, Volume 3 by Clive Barker, and in the 1986 movie, the beast is portrayed as a bloodthirsty killer who wants to consume humans. The key difference between Rawhead Rex and other flesh-eating monsters is that Rawhead Rex has a particular preference for children. It's especially evident in the story, where it's revealed that children are tastier for him than adults. This characteristic adds up to his terrorizing of the small village, where the only goal is to satisfy his endless hunger. Moreover, the most horrifying part of him, and the reason why he's one of the most dreadful, was that he was a product of real-life horrors. In the story, although Clive Barker places the monster in an English village, this wasn't always the case. In fact, the author wanted the beast to be able to consume the most precious of human treasures: family, faith, and friends. Thus, the author makes a chilling point that the most horrifying monster stories are the ones that are close to real life. To summarize, in Rawhead Rex by Clive Barker, the short story depicted the most horrifying type of monster that satisfied his endless hunger by consuming humans. The frightening part of Rawhead Rex was that he didn't have any other motivation for his kills and actions except his insatiable hunger. Therefore, there was no way to reason with this type of monster, and the only way to stop him was to remove his food supply. Does Rawhead Rex have any powers beyond brute force? The answer to that is yes. Rawhead Rex was indeed more powerful than just brute strength. In addition to his oversized body and violent nature, he possessed the ability to influence certain vulnerable individuals. The most notable example of Rawhead Rex's supernatural ability was the church verger Declan O'Brien, as depicted in the 1986 film. To begin with, it was the church verger who failed to protect the town from Rawhead Rex. Subsequently, Declan O'Brien was baptized by the monster and became fully possessed by it. It can be concluded that the supernatural power possessed by Rawhead Rex allowed him to corrupt minds and influence the behavior of certain individuals. The character was not only a violent physical threat, but also a supernatural force that was capable of corrupting vulnerable minds. Instead of fighting Declan O'Brien, Rawhead Rex made him violent and abusive, and made use of his aggression against the other villagers. It can be suggested that the power influencing the minds of the people was somehow connected with Rawhead Rex's red glowing eyes. It wasn't typical mind control as demonstrated in many films, where the character would look into the other people's eyes and they would start obeying his every word. Instead, it was a slow process of corrupting the minds of already violent and aggressive individuals. Declan O'Brien appeared to be more vulnerable to Rawhead Rex's influence than other villagers. It appeared that some people became assistants and followers of the monster, while the rest were not impacted by his violent nature. What's Rawhead Rex's one genuine weakness? Although Rawhead Rex was impossibly strong and durable, the character had one glaring weakness. It wasn't another monstrous creature, a powerful spell, or a weapon that could injure. According to the short story by Clive Barker, Rawhead Rex was especially afraid of women, fertility, and childbirth. Indeed, in the original story, it's the only monster that avoids pregnant women and those bleeding from menstruation, being frightened and disgusted by them. Thus, the only hope for getting rid of the beast was to use this weakness. Interestingly, many critics believe that this symbolism was intentional. They argued that Barker designed Rawhead Rex as an aggressively masculine and predatory creature, whose fear of fertility and female reproductive power became one of the story's most defining symbolic ideas. From this perspective, Barker contrasted Rawhead Rex's aggressively masculine nature with female fertility, which made the monster's fear of reproductive power one of the story's most defining symbolic ideas. Thus, the monster wasn't killed by a more powerful entity or a deadly spell, but lost in the fight against the concept of fertility and childbirth. In fact, it can be said that the source short story as well as a 1986 film adaptation, does not have a standard monster slayer narrative. Instead of a powerful opponent or a fatal injury from uncommon materials, Rawhead Rex dies because of the hated and feared weakness. In both the short story and the film, the character is killed by a statue of a woman having a child, a Sheila Nagig, located inside the church. It can be said that instead of killing the beast with conventional means, people used the only thing that made Rawhead Rex vulnerable and weak. How does Rawhead Rex accidentally cause his own downfall in the original story? One of the most surprising things about Rawhead Rex in the initial short story by Clive Barker was that it wasn't defeated directly. In fact, one could say that Rawhead Rex played a crucial role in its own defeat. Although it seemed invincible on many occasions, several mistakes on its part made it vulnerable in the crucial confrontation. As Rawhead Rex wandered around, it encountered gasoline and used it to create fire that would eventually contribute to his downfall. Indeed, initially the fire only destroyed the objects the beast had already harmed. It soon got out of control and thus threatened Rawhead Rex itself. Although Rawhead Rex escaped the flames, which were spreading rapidly towards the center of the town, it couldn't see anything due to the smoke. As mentioned earlier, the flames injured its eyes, and consequently the monster became blind. In the final confrontation, it was unable to see the stone birth idol because of its poor vision. Without the blindness caused by the fire, Rawhead Rex would have recognized the idol and prevented its defeat. However, his damaged vision allowed the villagers to use it against him. Therefore, the villain wasn't defeated by the villagers, but by its own carelessness, which resulted in the fire and the blindness that eventually caused its death. Why does Rawhead Rex baptize his victims? One of the most horrifying parts about Rawhead Rex, without doubt, is the baptism that the creature performs on some of its victims. It's the fact that Rex somehow corrupts some of the victims with a supernatural ritual that gives it the most gruesome and terrifying impression. The most prominent example of this particular ability is Declan O'Brien, the church verger who's corrupted by Rex and becomes his follower, although he eventually helps kill him as well. It's this ability to corrupt people in a weird parody baptism that seems to be the most horrifying part of the entire movie. The corrupted man follows all of Rex's orders, even though they lead to the suffering of the entire village, although he eventually helps the protagonist kill the monster. The most evident theory, although it is merely a theory, is that it serves as a parody of the real Christian baptism, which is, in fact, most likely the reason behind this ability being in the movie at all. It's not stated outright, but it's heavily implied in the movie that Declan is a follower of Rex, obeying all of his orders, even the ones that lead to the deaths and suffering of the people from the village. Even though he denies it later, he's the one that aids the protagonist in the slaying of Rex, which shows that the obedience that the man displayed wasn't complete. With these facts in mind, it's fairly easy to come to terms with the theory that Rex's baptism is a twisted parody of a real one. It's a known fact, at least within the movie itself, that Rex has been buried within the church grounds centuries ago. This, in fact, is the reason why he's unearthed in the first place. This single fact creates a certain degree of an ironic twist upon the entire concept of Christian baptism, as virtually every death and every act committed by Rex are committed in mockery of Christianity in general, and the sacred sacraments in particular. What's Rawhead's single most savage moment in the story? It's hard to think of the single most savage episode or moment in the story because Rawhead Rex has committed numerous horrendous and monstrous acts. Most of these moments showed us his violent nature. However, there is one moment that stands out in terms of the savage act committed by the beast and the impact that it had on the change in the victim's family perspective on the monster. For example, he killed Detective Sergeant Gissing after beating him up and burning him to death. This showed that Rawhead Rex was not simply just killing his victims, but was also capable of extreme cruelty. The other example could be the decision of the beast to kill the child in the barn during the stormy night, which showed that even the most vulnerable victims are not safe from him. However, the most savage moment in the story seems to be the killing of Ron Milton's son. This act was savage because of the changes that it triggered in Ron Milton's life and attitude towards the beast. Indeed, Rawhead Rex wasn't satisfied with the killing of the child and decided to burn him to death, which made Ron realize that he shouldn't run away from the beast anymore. Before that moment, he saw Rawhead Rex as a monster, but didn't attempt to stop him because he thought of himself as powerless. However, killing his son made Ron see the beast as an enemy, which means that it changed his perspective on the monster. How different is the 1986 film from Barker's original story? The 1986 movie adaptation of Rawhead Rex was not a direct port of the short story. Taking the concept and the most memorable elements of the original source material, the creators of the movie transformed it into an entirely different product, with a different setting, different characters, added subplots, and a different ending. The film adaptation of Rawhead Rex was only loosely based on the original short story. Both tell the tale of an ancient monster awaking in modern-day England and going on a killing spree, but the similarities stay in the general premise. Set in the fictitious village of Zealand Deal in Kent, Rawhead Rex in Books of Blood Volume 3 was about Ron Milton, the neighbor of the Garrow family, who accidentally released the monstrous Rawhead Rex. The film adaptation was set in the Irish community of Wicklow, where the movie was actually filmed. The farmer who released Rawhead Rex was renamed from Thomas Garrow in the story to Tom Guerin in the movie. The creator of the film adaptation of Rawhead Rex stayed true to the source material in terms of the central conflict, the terror of the small village and the ancient evil that caused it. However, the most significant differences were introduced in the movie by the producers in Ireland. They changed the very concept of the main character. Unlike in the short story where he was the neighbor of Tom Garrow and actually named Ron Milton, in the movie he was an outsider, American by birth, named Howard Hollenbeck, played by David Dukes. This change in the movie adaptation of Rawhead Rex affected literally everything else that happened in the film. Unlike Ron Milton, who was familiar with Rawhead Rex and its history and actually had to engage the monster in combat, Howard Hollenbeck was a stranger to the local village. In fact, he was investigating the series of murders and potential occult rituals behind it. And when it came to actually battling Rawhead Rex, he wasn't the one who battled the monster. In the film adaptation of Rawhead Rex, the battle belonged to Howard's wife, Elaine Hollenbeck, who had almost nothing to do with the events leading up to Rawhead Rex's appearance in the small village. The differences between the film adaptation and the original short story weren't limited to changes in the main characters and their relationship with each other. In the Rawhead Rex short story by Clive Barker, the confrontation with the monster was the climax at the end of the story. After Ron Milton beheaded Rawhead Rex with the birth idol, the monster was gone for good. Not only was this a significant difference between the movie and the short story, but it also marked the end of the film. In the movie adaptation of Rawhead Rex, after Rawhead Rex was buried under the rocks and boulders, it broke free and roared, leaving open the possibility of it being seen again. Overall, the movie adaptation of Rawhead Rex by Clive Barker was significantly changed from the original source material. The differences included the main character and the setting, subplots, and the ending. Why did Clive Barker disown his own movie? Clive Barker is known for expressing rather negative views concerning the 1986 movie Rawhead Rex, which was based on his own work. Unlike some adaptations where the original creator had more control, Barker felt that he had a slight influence over how the finished film was eventually presented. This, although Rawhead Rex is based originally on plot ideas developed by Clive Barker, he was highly dissatisfied with its final version. When Rawhead Rex was released, the author's criticism of the film primarily consisted of remarks on his limited impact on the project, as well as several negative comments concerning the final result of his work. In fact, Barker was especially surprised and disappointed by the film's failure to achieve the desired effect. Although the film followed the basic structure of his screenplay, Barker felt that the atmosphere and execution didn't match his original vision. However, the writer had a problem with the fact that the film's overall atmosphere was completely different from what he expected. It was also reported that the problem was made worse by the fact that the writer became particularly annoyed and upset by the film's failure, which eventually spoiled his attitude to the entire project, as well as any related activity for years. According to him, his feelings towards Rawhead Rex and its director could only be described as disgust, and he even claimed to have hated Underworld, which was another early film connected to his work. Therefore, Barker was so disappointed in his first venture into filmmaking that he decided to become a director himself. This way, he could exercise more control over the final result, and eventually earned a critical acclaim with Hellraiser. The exact reason for such an idea to emerge might have been the controversy surrounding the author's work, but it's unlikely that he would be so embarrassed and enraged by Rawhead Rex if it weren't for his personal contribution to the project's realization. The director of Rawhead Rex, George Pavlou, strongly disagreed with the published assumption, stating that this was nothing but a rumor. Nevertheless, the writer's concerns did have a great impact on his attitude towards movie directing, although the exact influence of Rawhead Rex on that decision remains debated. In fact, the directorial debut of Clive Barker was made before Rawhead Rex was released, and therefore the film couldn't affect the writer's decisions. In other words, although the creation of Rawhead Rex might have prompted Clive Barker to become a director, his comments on the film being the reason for his directorial debut are mostly exaggerated. What behind-the-scenes trivia should fans know? Although Rawhead Rex was remembered for Clive Barker's disappointment with the final film, there were still a few intriguing facts about the film that a few people seem to know. For one, the role of Rawhead Rex himself was originally offered to Peter Mayhew, who had earlier starred as Chewbacca in the Star Wars film series. However, his asking fee was reportedly too high for the production, and eventually the role went to Heinrich von Schellendorf, who was 19 years old at the time. In addition, the costume was really difficult to work with, and Schellendorf reportedly needed around 2 hours every day to put the thing on before filming. Another interesting fact involves the 1993 comic adaptation of Barker's original story. It was written by Steve Niles of 30 Days of Night fame and drawn by Les Edwards, and it was supposedly the most grotesque comic adaptation. Many fans considered that this version was closer to Barker's original vision of Rawhead Rex than the 1986 movie, had managed to achieve. The last intriguing fact is that there was apparently supposed to be a reboot of Rawhead Rex. According to Clive Barker, he did express an interest in directing a remake himself. However, it seems that the idea never moved into production. In the end, Rawhead Rex became a weird example of how failure can sometimes create something even better. The movie was criticized for its execution, but its disappointing reception pushed Clive Barker to take more control of his own stories and eventually direct Hellraiser, which was one of the most influential horror movies that's ever been made. So while Rawhead Rex might not have been the classic monster it was meant to be, its legacy actually became far more important than its success at the box office. What horror creature should we discuss next? Should we explore the twisted anatomy of Pinhead, the terrifying evolution of a xenomorph, or the dark origins of Freddy Krueger? Let us know in the comments below. Have a great day, and as always,